A waitress has no business betting an engineer. The sentence floated across the ballroom with the effortless confidence of a man who had never expected to be wrong. It didn't sound loud. It didn't need to. In a room where billion-dollar partnerships were negotiated over crystal glasses and polished silver, arrogance always carried farther than applause. The Grand Lexington Hotel in downtown Chicago glittered beneath cascading chandeliers that painted the marble floor in warm gold. Investors laughed softly. Executives exchanged rehearsed smiles. Camera flashes bounced off black tuxedos and tailored evening gowns while a jazz trio played just loudly enough to remind everyone that this was a celebration of success. At the center of it all stood Ethan Carter, the Billionaire's star engineer, the brilliant mind behind Helix Dynamics' most celebrated artificial intelligence platform. At 34, Ethan had become something of a legend in the tech world. Magazine covers called him the architect of tomorrow. Business podcasts praised his impossible standards. Inside Helix Dynamics, junior engineers spoke his name with the same mixture of admiration and fear usually reserved for championship coaches or decorated generals. Tonight, surrounded by executives and venture capitalists, he looked exactly like the image the media loved to sell. Confident, polished, untouchable. A few feet away, balancing a polished tray with practiced ease, Naomi Brooks moved quietly between tables. 28 years old, dressed in a simple black server uniform, she seemed invisible to nearly everyone in the ballroom. She refilled water glasses before anyone asked. She noticed empty plates before guests looked down. She thanked people who barely acknowledged she existed. In rooms like these, good service often meant disappearing completely. Ethan barely glanced at her before extending his empty glass without lifting his eyes from the conversation. Naomi stepped forward, carefully pouring sparkling water while several executives discussed a demonstration scheduled for later that evening. One investor mentioned an engineering challenge that had reportedly taken months to solve. Ethan smiled with unmistakable pride. "Not everyone is built to understand problems like that," he said, just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Then his eyes drifted toward Naomi. Certainly not someone carrying a serving tray. A few uncomfortable chuckles escaped around the table. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody corrected him. The music continued as though nothing had happened. Naomi placed the bottle back onto her tray without rushing. She didn't argue. She didn't force a smile. She simply looked at Ethan with an expression so calm it almost seemed out of place in a room growing heavier by the second. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice steady enough to cut through every whispered conversation without ever becoming loud, she said, "I'll bet you $100,000 that before this night is over, you'll wish you hadn't said that." The laughter vanished. Glasses stopped halfway to waiting hands. Somewhere across the ballroom, a violin continued playing alone for two lonely notes before the rest of the trio followed. Even the billionaire CEO, standing near the stage, slowly turned his head toward the unexpected silence. Ethan blinked once, certain he had misheard. Around him, investors exchanged confused glances while several phones quietly tilted upward, their cameras now recording something far more interesting than the evening's scheduled presentation. Naomi didn't move. She didn't repeat herself. She simply waited, holding the tray as naturally as if nothing unusual had happened at all. For the first time that evening, the most celebrated engineer in the room found himself searching for words that refused to come. No one spoke for what felt like an entire minute, although the clock above the ballroom entrance insisted only a few seconds had passed. The silence settled over the Grand Lexington Hotel like fresh snow, covering every conversation that had filled the room only moments before. They had seen confidence before. They had also seen certainty collapse without warning. Ethan slowly crossed his arms and studied Naomi Brooks as though seeing her for the first time. She stood perfectly still beside the linen-covered table, her serving tray balanced effortlessly against one hand. There was no anger on her face, no embarrassment, no attempt to prove herself through louder words. That calm unsettled him more than any argument could have. $100,000? Ethan asked with a faint smile. That is a very expensive mistake. Naomi met his eyes without hesitation. Only if I lose. Another wave of whispers rolled through the guests. Several investors exchanged curious looks. One woman quietly lowered the champagne glass she had been raising toward her lips. A venture capitalist reached for his phone, pretending to answer a message while secretly recording everything unfolding nearby. At the far end of the ballroom, Daniel Whitmore, the billionaire founder and chief executive officer of Helix Dynamics, remained silent beside the presentation stage. He had built his company by observing people long before judging them. While everyone else focused on the challenge itself, Daniel watched the two faces standing opposite each other. Ethan looked confident because he always expected control. Naomi looked confident because she seemed to need nothing from the room around her. Those were two very different kinds of confidence. The master of ceremonies hesitated before stepping toward the microphone, unsure whether to continue the evening schedule or allow the unexpected confrontation to play out. He glanced toward Daniel. The billionaire simply lifted one finger, signaling him to wait. Something far more valuable than the prepared program was beginning to unfold. Naomi gently placed the water bottle onto a nearby service station before folding her hands in front of her apron. Her heartbeat was steady. It had taken years to reach that kind of composure. Years of being overlooked. Years of listening more than speaking. Years of learning that the loudest voice in the room was rarely the wisest one. Ethan tilted his head. "Tell me something," he said. "What exactly makes you believe you can challenge someone who designs artificial intelligence systems used by Fortune 500 companies?" Naomi answered almost immediately. "Because facts do not care about job titles." That sentence landed with surprising weight. Nobody laughed this time. Daniel Whitmore noticed several senior engineers standing near the demonstration area, quietly turning toward the conversation. They recognized something Ethan had not. Naomi was choosing her words with unusual precision, almost like someone accustomed to technical discussions rather than casual conversation. Ethan sensed the shift in the room. He had spent years becoming the smartest person wherever he went, and he could feel attention slowly drifting away from his reputation and toward the woman in the black server uniform. That was unacceptable. He smiled again, straighter this time, as though preparing for a presentation instead of a debate. "Fine," he said. "If you believe you belong in this conversation, then let us find out exactly how much your confidence is worth." The challenge spread across the ballroom faster than any keynote announcement ever could. Conversations dissolved into quiet speculation as guests abandoned their assigned tables, forming a respectful circle around the center of the room without anyone asking them to move. It was remarkable how quickly luxury gave way to curiosity. Crystal chandeliers still shimmered above them. The jazz trio continued playing softly in the background. Waiters carried silver trays through narrow openings between guests. Yet the evening no longer belonged to the scheduled product launch. It belonged to a question nobody had expected to hear. Ethan Carter walked toward the demonstration platform with measured confidence, every polished step reinforcing the reputation he had spent more than a decade building. He was not merely an accomplished engineer. He was the public face of Helix Dynamics innovation. Universities invited him to deliver commencement speeches. Technology magazines called him the mind behind the company's record-breaking valuation. His algorithms powered hospitals, transportation systems, and financial institutions across the country. Failure had become so unfamiliar that he no longer considered it a realistic possibility. That certainty had quietly become part of his identity. Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she was until another server gently accepted her tray without speaking. She thanked her coworker with a small nod before walking toward the demonstration area. There was no dramatic entrance, no determined march. She simply crossed the marble floor with calm, unhurried steps, as though she had walked into rooms like this her entire life. Some guests watched her with sympathy, others with amusement, a few with genuine curiosity. Daniel Whitmore observed every expression without saying a word. Years of leading one of the most influential technology companies in America had taught him that intelligence often announced itself quietly, while insecurity usually entered the room demanding attention. Ethan rested one hand against the demonstration table where a digital display showed architectural diagrams from Helix Dynamics' newest artificial intelligence platform. He tapped the screen once before turning toward Naomi. "You wanted a chance," he said. "Now you have one." His voice remained calm, but there was something different beneath it. He was no longer dismissing her. He was preparing to defeat her publicly. Several senior engineers moved closer, folding their arms as they waited. They expected an elegant demonstration of expertise, followed by polite applause. One executive quietly whispered that the evening would finally return to normal in a few minutes. Daniel did not answer. He kept watching Naomi instead. She studied the engineering diagrams without stepping closer. Her eyes moved carefully across the display, not with confusion. "Do you need more time?" he asked. Naomi looked up calmly. "No," she replied. "I was simply wondering why your optimization layer is compensating for an error that should not exist in the first place." The sentence landed with the quiet force of a lightning strike. Three engineers exchanged immediate glances. One frowned. Another instinctively looked back toward the digital model. Ethan's confident smile remained, but it no longer reached his eyes. Daniel Whitmore noticed something almost nobody else caught. Ethan had not answered the question. For the first time that evening, the room stopped seeing a waitress standing before an engineer. Instead, they saw two minds preparing to test each other, and nobody could predict which one truly understood the system better. The room remained perfectly still, but the silence no longer belonged to surprise. It belonged to calculation. Every engineer near the demonstration platform instinctively leaned closer to the digital display, searching for the flaw Naomi Brooks had mentioned. Ethan Carter noticed the movement immediately. He had spent years commanding rooms filled with brilliant people, and he understood the danger of hesitation. If doubt entered the conversation, authority often left through the same door. He folded his hands behind his back and smiled with practiced composure. Instead, she focused on the smallest subsystem tucked into the lower corner of the display, one that most guests had probably never noticed. "Your optimization layer is working much harder than it should," she said calmly. "That only happens when another process is quietly correcting inefficient decisions upstream." One senior engineer frowned. Another slowly uncrossed his arms. A third opened a tablet and began reviewing the system documentation without anyone asking him to. Ethan answered almost immediately. "That process is intentional. It improves stability during unpredictable workloads." Naomi nodded once. "Yes, it does. But only because the prediction engine is compensating for unnecessary latency that was introduced much earlier." Another silence followed. This one felt different. It was no longer filled with curiosity. It was filled with concentration. Around the ballroom, conversations had completely disappeared. Even the hotel staff found themselves slowing their work without realizing it. Guests who had arrived expecting speeches and champagne now watched two strangers exchange technical observations with the intensity of a championship match. Daniel quietly noticed several members of Helix Dynamics' engineering division looking less confident than they had only minutes earlier. They were not reacting to Naomi's confidence alone. They were reacting to the accuracy of her language. She was not speaking like someone repeating articles she had read online. She was describing cause and effect with the precision of someone who had spent countless hours solving problems exactly like this one. Ethan walked toward the display and expanded the system model onto the largest screen in the ballroom. One of them suddenly stopped scrolling through his tablet. His expression changed almost instantly. Daniel Whitmore caught the reaction before anyone else did. It was the unmistakable face of an expert who had just recognized a possibility he had never considered before. Ethan saw it too, and although his posture remained perfectly straight, the certainty that had carried him through the evening began to feel just a little heavier. Every eye followed Naomi Brooks as she calmly lowered her hand from the massive display. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody wanted to interrupt the fragile moment between confidence and proof. Ethan Carter took one slow breath before stepping toward the control console. He entered a series of commands with practiced speed, pulling up diagnostic reports that only Helix Dynamics engineers normally accessed during internal reviews. Bright charts filled the giant screen. Performance metrics streamed across multiple windows. To most people in the ballroom, the information looked impossibly complex. To the engineers standing closest to the stage, it looked painfully familiar. Ethan glanced at the results before turning back toward Naomi. "The system passed every benchmark we designed," he said. "Independent auditors verified these numbers. Thousands of simulations confirmed our architecture." Naomi nodded without the slightest hint of disagreement. "I believe they did," she replied. "Benchmarks only prove a system performs well under the conditions you expect. They rarely expose the assumptions you forgot to question." A quiet murmur spread through the engineering team. Daniel Whitmore folded his arms, saying nothing, then introduced simultaneous requests from 3 independent regions instead of one. Several engineers exchanged uncertain looks. One quietly whispered that those settings were never demonstrated during public presentations because they represented an unusually demanding workload. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before entering the new parameters. "Satisfied?" he asked. Naomi simply answered, "Run it." The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Rows of digital indicators began updating across the enormous display. At first, everything looked exactly as Ethan expected. Response times remained excellent. Resource consumption stayed within acceptable limits. A few guests smiled, believing the demonstration had already settled the argument. Then one small graph changed direction. A senior systems architect narrowed his eyes. Another chart followed. Processing efficiency began slipping by fractions of a percent. The numbers were still impressive, but they were moving steadily away from their projected range. Ethan immediately opened another diagnostic window. "Background optimization is compensating," he said confidently, although his voice carried less certainty than before. Naomi never looked away from the screen. "Exactly," she answered. "Now ask yourself why it needs to." Another engineer quickly compared the live data with archived development reports. His fingers stopped moving across the tablet. He looked toward Ethan, then toward Daniel Whitmore, unsure whether to interrupt. Daniel noticed the hesitation and gave him a small nod. "Go ahead," the billionaire said calmly. The engineer cleared his throat. "The optimization layer is consuming nearly twice the resources we predicted under this configuration." Nobody reacted immediately. The sentence simply settled over the room, growing heavier with every passing second. Ethan stared at the display, scrolling through additional diagnostics with increasing speed. The architecture was, she had claimed it was quietly correcting a deeper inefficiency that nobody had bothered to investigate because the final results looked acceptable. Daniel Whitmore looked from the screen to Naomi and realized something extraordinary was unfolding. She had not come to embarrass anyone. She had come to reveal a question that everyone else had stopped asking. And for the first time that evening, the most accomplished engineers in the room were no longer trying to prove her wrong. They were trying to understand how she had seen it first. Daniel Whitmore slowly stepped closer to the demonstration platform, saying nothing as another engineer verified the live diagnostics on a separate workstation. The ballroom had become so quiet that the faint hum of cooling fans inside the demonstration equipment seemed unusually loud. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the glowing screens, where numbers continued updating in real time. Nobody was watching the chandeliers anymore. Nobody cared about the dinner service. They wanted answers. Ethan Carter reviewed line after line of performance data, his movements becoming more deliberate with each passing second. He was no longer trying to impress the audience. He was trying to understand why the system was behaving exactly as Naomi Brooks had predicted. The optimization layer continued absorbing workloads that should never have reached it in the first place. The platform remained stable, but stability now carried an uncomfortable price. It was consuming hidden resources that no executive report had ever highlighted because the final customer experience still looked excellent. Naomi quietly waited without interrupting. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. She understood that discovering a hidden weakness was only the beginning. Accepting it was always the harder part. One senior engineer finally broke the silence. "She is right," he admitted softly while comparing archived development logs with the live simulation. "The compensation routine has been masking this pattern for more than 2 years." Another engineer looked up from his tablet with visible surprise. We never traced them back to the original prediction model. The words hung in the air like an unexpected confession. Daniel looked toward Ethan, whose expression had become remarkably calm despite the growing tension around him. Brilliant people often reached an important crossroads when confronted with evidence that challenged their certainty. Some defended their pride. Others pursued the truth. Nobody yet knew which path Ethan would choose. He slowly turned toward Naomi. "How did you notice it?" he asked. There was no sarcasm left in his voice, only genuine curiosity. Naomi looked briefly at the architecture diagram before answering. "Because the system is solving the wrong problem beautifully. Whenever software appears too efficient, I ask what invisible work it is hiding." Several engineers exchanged thoughtful glances. The sentence sounded simple, yet everyone in the technical division understood its significance. Elegant systems rarely concealed unnecessary complexity without a reason. Daniel watched Naomi carefully. Her explanation carried no trace of rehearsed brilliance. She spoke the way experienced engineers often did after years of solving difficult problems. She focused on principles instead of showing off knowledge. That detail unsettled him more than the technical discovery itself. He had met thousands of talented professionals during his career, and humility paired with extraordinary competence was far rarer than genius alone. One of the company's oldest architects suddenly leaned closer to the screen. His eyes widened almost immediately. "Wait," he whispered. "This optimization logic looks familiar." He opened an archived design repository that had not been discussed in years. After searching through several historical documents, he stopped on a development note carrying a date from nearly 8 years earlier. The room watched silently as he enlarged a faded engineering diagram. Several structural concepts matched the architecture standing before them tonight with remarkable precision. "Sir, I think I have seen this design philosophy before." Daniel narrowed his eyes. A distant memory stirred somewhere deep inside his mind, connected to a name he had not heard in years. He looked back at Naomi, whose calm expression never changed, and for the first time that evening, he began to wonder whether the woman everyone had mistaken for an ordinary waitress had walked into the ballroom carrying a history far greater than anyone in the room had imagined. The veteran architect carefully enlarged another page from the archived repository, and the aging engineering notes appeared across the giant display like forgotten pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Every member of the Helix Dynamics technical team instinctively stepped closer. The sketches were simple, almost understated, yet the logic behind them was unmistakable. Instead of forcing the prediction engine to compensate for uncertainty after it appeared, the original design prevented unnecessary corrections before they became necessary. It was elegant in a way that only years of practical experience could produce. Daniel Whitmore stared at the diagrams without blinking. Memories returned one detail at a time. A strategy meeting nearly a decade earlier. A conference room filled with ambitious engineers. A young systems architect who kept asking uncomfortable questions instead of offering comfortable answers. He remembered rejecting several proposals because the company's priorities had shifted toward rapid expansion. Some ideas had quietly disappeared into storage as deadlines replaced long-term refinement. Daniel slowly looked from the archive diagrams to Naomi Brooks. The similarities were becoming impossible to ignore. Ethan Carter examined the same documents with growing concentration. He compared the archived architecture to the current platform, then looked back at Naomi. "These concepts are remarkably close to the optimization principles you described," he admitted. "Most people outside this company would never have seen these files." Naomi answered without hesitation. No, they would not. The simplicity of her response only deepened the mystery. One senior engineer searched through additional historical records, scrolling past years of design revisions and internal reviews. Suddenly he stopped. A faded project roster appeared near the bottom of the screen. Several names were listed beside specialized responsibilities. The engineer quietly read them before looking toward Daniel. This project had an original systems consultant before the final team was assembled, he said. According to these records, The consultant resigned before development entered production. Daniel nodded slowly, remembering fragments that had long been buried beneath countless acquisitions and product launches. I remember the project, he said softly. I do not remember why the consultant left. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Ethan finally looked directly at Naomi. Did you know the consultant? He asked. Naomi met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried all evening. Very well, she replied. The ballroom seemed to grow even quieter. The answer was truthful, yet it revealed almost nothing. Daniel noticed that she never volunteered information to impress anyone. She responded only to what was asked, allowing others to reach their own conclusions. That restraint carried its own quiet confidence. The veteran architect continued searching through archive correspondence until another document appeared. It contained handwritten technical comments attached to one of the earliest design reviews. Although the signature had been partially obscured by an old digital scan, one distinctive initial remained perfectly visible. The architect slowly inhaled before turning the monitor toward Daniel. Sir, he said carefully, I believe we finally know whose design philosophy shaped the foundation of this platform. Daniel studied the signature for several long moments. Then he looked back at Naomi, and recognition finally settled across his face. It was not the recognition of a billionaire identifying a waitress. It was the recognition of a leader realizing he had unknowingly spent an entire evening listening to one of the most gifted engineering minds his company had ever encountered. Around the ballroom, the whispers stopped completely. Even Ethan Carter remained silent, because for the first time that night, the question was no longer whether Naomi understood the system better than anyone expected. The question had become how someone with knowledge this extraordinary had disappeared from the technology world and quietly returned wearing the uniform that had caused everyone to underestimate her. Daniel Whitmore slowly reached toward the archived document, enlarging the final page until the faded signature became unmistakably clear. The ballroom screens displayed only a name now, small in appearance, yet suddenly carrying more weight than every corporate logo surrounding it. Naomi Brooks. No dramatic music announced the revelation. No one gasped loudly. The truth was powerful precisely because it arrived so quietly. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening another historical file stored deep inside the company's digital archive. An employee profile appeared beside the engineering documents. It showed a younger Naomi standing in front of a research laboratory instead of a hotel dining room. Several patents were listed beneath her photograph. Internal commendations followed. Then came a final notation entered almost 8 years earlier. Voluntary resignation. Project discontinued. No further explanation. The room remained frozen. One executive whispered, "She helped build the foundation before Helix Dynamics became what it is today." Another quietly replied, "And none of us recognized her." Ethan Carter stared at the screen without speaking. He read every document carefully, comparing dates, technical notes, and architectural concepts with the platform he had spent years refining. The realization settled slowly but completely. The prediction model he had defended all evening had grown from ideas Naomi had originally introduced before she disappeared from the company. He turned toward her with an expression that no longer contained pride or disbelief. It contained respect mixed with unanswered questions. "Why did you leave?" he finally asked. Naomi looked across the ballroom, where hundreds of successful people now watched her with entirely different eyes than they had an hour earlier. "Because sometimes people become more interested in who receives credit than whether the work becomes better," she answered calmly. "When that happens, innovation slows down." Nobody challenged her. Several older employees quietly lowered their eyes, remembering difficult years inside the company when rapid expansion often mattered more than thoughtful collaboration. Daniel Whitmore remained silent for another long moment before speaking with unusual honesty. "I should have asked more questions back then," he admitted. "I allowed urgent deadlines to replace careful listening." Those words surprised everyone. Billionaires were accustomed to giving answers, not acknowledging missed opportunities. Naomi simply nodded. "Every organization grows," she said. "The important question is whether it also learns." Ethan looked back toward the live diagnostics still running across the display. The optimization layer continued correcting the hidden inefficiency exactly as Naomi had predicted. There was no longer any doubt. The evidence had become impossible to dismiss. The technical team had already confirmed every observation through independent analysis. One by one, engineers who had arrived expecting to witness an embarrassing mistake instead found themselves quietly taking notes from the woman they had mistaken for someone with no technical background. Daniel looked around the ballroom before addressing the audience. Tonight was supposed to celebrate innovation, he said. Instead, it reminded us where innovation truly begins. It begins the moment we stop assuming that wisdom wears a particular title, office, or uniform. His words were followed not by immediate applause, but by thoughtful silence. It was the kind of silence that appears only when people realize they have witnessed something that permanently changes the way they see others. Standing beneath the warm light of the chandeliers, Naomi remained exactly as composed as she had been from the beginning, while the room slowly understood that the greatest surprise of the evening was never hidden inside the software. It had been quietly serving dinner all along. Daniel Whitmore slowly walked to the center of the ballroom until he stood beside Naomi Brooks instead of above her. It was a small movement, but everyone in the room understood its meaning. Leadership was not measured only by the height of a stage. Sometimes it was measured by the willingness to step down from it. He looked across the audience before turning toward Ethan Carter. "The wager is over," he said calmly. "The outcome is clear." Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment, then walked forward without hesitation. The confidence that had defined him all evening had not disappeared. It had simply transformed into something far more valuable. He stopped in front of Naomi and extended his hand. "I judged your uniform before I listened to your ideas," he said. "That was my mistake, and I apologize." The ballroom remained silent as Naomi accepted the handshake. There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction at proving someone wrong. Daniel Whitmore quietly smiled, recognizing the lesson before anyone else spoke. Naomi continued, her voice calm enough that every guest leaned forward to hear each word. "If you truly want to honor the wager, invest that money in young engineers whose talent is overlooked because of where they come from, what they wear, or the title printed on their name badge. Give someone an opportunity before they have to fight for respect." Ethan slowly folded the check and placed it back into his pocket. "That will happen," he answered. "Personally, I will make certain of it." Daniel stepped forward once more. "And Helix Dynamics will do the same." He turned toward the audience. "Beginning tonight, we will establish a fellowship dedicated to discovering talented innovators whose potential has been ignored. Excellence does not belong to one background, one neighborhood, or one profession. We have been reminded of that in the most unforgettable way possible." This time the applause came naturally. It began with a single engineer, then another, until the entire ballroom rose to its feet. The standing ovation lasted far longer than anyone had planned for the evening's keynote address. Yet Naomi remained exactly as she had been when she first entered the room carrying a serving tray. Humble, composed, unchanged by recognition because her character had never depended on it. As guests slowly returned to their conversations, many no longer noticed the elegant chandeliers or the expensive decorations surrounding them. They remembered something far more enduring. A brilliant mind had never needed an expensive suit to become extraordinary. It had only needed one moment for the world to stop looking at a uniform and finally start listening to a human being. And long after the lights dimmed and the ballroom emptied, the lesson remained unmistakably clear. Power may command attention, but respect is earned only by those willing to see the dignity in every person before judging their place in the room.